Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. We're speaking with Reverend Dr. Gordon Preece, the University of Divinity, the Centre of Research into Religion and Social Policy. We were speaking with Gordon last week, and we're speaking about a public conversation into euthanasia. Thanks for coming back, Gordon.
Pleasure.
And we were just addressing some of the issues which arise out of euthanasia. Could you reiterate that from?
Well, at one particular point, the issue of what many people may have seen, someone who made almost decide to die at a particular time. You know, sometimes that happens quite naturally. You know, they stop eating or whatever. That issue was raised by John Cleary in relationship to his late mother, and the doctor apparently said something like, well, she'll die when she wants to die. She's kind of decided. And also that they were increasing the level of morphine. And John said that he was unsure exactly what that meant.
Yeah.
You know, was this that, you know, she was being actually euthanized?
Yes.
Or that they were increasing the level of morphine just to ease her death, but it was clear that she was going.
Yeah.
And just to ease her pain, which is a legitimate
activity,
medical activity. And Peter Singer really ran with that quite a lot, and used it to say that in actual fact, what is going on is that there's a lot of voluntary euthanasia, but unregulated, that's going on already. And that a survey that he and Helga Kuza had put together a number of years ago had shown that, and doctors had said, well, they'd participated in forms of euthanasia. Yeah. That, I think, came crashing down in some ways when Margaret Somerville mentioned that she, in a previous life, happened to be a chemist, a pharmacist, and that it takes an awful lot of morphine to actually kill someone. It's extremely difficult to. Medical doctor Dr. Denise Cooper-Clark, who's also a PhD, a colleague of mine, teaches bioethics. She says it's almost impossible to do it.
Yes.
And so a lot of doctors who think they've actually done it haven't.
Right.
They're actually misled about that. So it's a bit of a furphy, really. And but that raises the issue about what do you do in seeking to help people have a good or dignified death.
Yes.
And the main answer to that is good palliative care. That good palliative care should be able to ease the dying of people, and people will say, well, in just about every case. Now, the issue is about having the resources for that, though. But certainly in terms of my own father's case, he was in a very good Catholic nursing home, and he died late last year. He had whole system Parkinson's, and that was hard watching him. It was very hard for him to speak. In his last days, you might get one word or so out of him. But he never asked to be helped to die. No. We had an advance care directive about what he wanted and what he didn't want. He didn't want the whole kitchen sink thrown at him to basically desperately keep him alive. Yeah. But so it came to a point where it was clear that he was dying and he was allowed to die. There wasn't any unnatural interference, etc., etc. And we had time to say goodbye, to sit by his bedside, etc. And he had an extraordinary care in that place. So I think a lot of people are scared about nursing homes or scared about losing their independence. I think that in the best models, and if we can make those available more broadly, then there can be places. Like I remember seeing him listening to The Sound of Music, not the movie, but actually put on as a play and a musical by the patients themselves under direction of the nuns, etc.
Yes,
Now, Dad
yes.
wasn't able to participate, but he watched and loved it.
Yeah.
There were children from the school who came and chatted to the
Right.
elderly.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful model, I think, of pastoral authenticity. Yes, the church may have lost authority these days, but there is still an enormous amount of pastoral authenticity out there, and I think that's critical in relationship to the issue of euthanasia.
Yeah.
The sense of people desperately holding on to their independence, but often they're very lonely. And how do you address the relational kinds of issues and the care and good palliative care, good nursing care, support at home as long as possible.
Yep.
Those are the ways in which we need to address this.
Yes.
The problem with the government does say we should increase palliative care in their proposal, but on the other hand, they say assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. Well, that's what they're actually saying, but they use euphemisms. The problem is, it comes back to it's the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton said. What is the cheaper one? Palliative care isn't enormously expensive, but it does involve labour.
Yep.
And it is more expensive than basically either just giving someone a pill that they can put on the shelf for up to 2 years, I think, in the government proposal, and when they want it, they can take it, or someone gives someone a needle, etc. The problem is the health system and nursing homes, etc. They're going increasingly for profit. When you talk about neoliberalism taking over health areas, the privatisation increasingly, and the profitisation of the health system, it will be overwhelmingly going towards euthanasia, voluntary, and likely non-voluntary over time, or even involuntary, because the profit motive will lead in that direction. And I think that will be a disaster for our society and the key institutions like the law and medicine.
Yes, absolutely. You can see the writing on the wall with that. Something that, and we're coming up to a break, so I'll just raise the issue is to say, look, how do we manage fear of death? What do you think sits behind this issue of fear of death, and how might we address that? All right. Okay, we're out of time. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony in Diversity. We're speaking with Reverend Dr. Gordon Preece. Gordon, we're on that key issue of how do you turn people's fear of dying off and get them to actually move into that as part of a natural order?
Well, I think it goes back maybe a step further, but the fear of ageing as well. And to go back to that story I told about this Catholic nursing home, it was wonderful the way they had these young children from the school, and who would go up and chat to these elderly people who were delighted to see them, and they could see this isn't something to fear in itself. That they could have a good conversation with them. One of the girls made a wonderful speech to them. And I think we need to model that kind of thing, and an intergenerational community, and not just sort of hang the elderly out to dry, if you like, or in isolation, but to see the huge contribution that they make. We have a church that's an all-age church like that, and there's relationships between. It's almost like adopted grandparents and uncles and aunts, etc., within the church. So I think we need to try and address that aspect, and I think we need to talk about death. I was at the funeral recently of an 18-year-old young man. There must have been 1,000 people there, overwhelmingly young, like from school, etc., etc. He had died suddenly of an asthma attack, and it was extremely tragic. And I think for most of them there, it was probably the first experience of losing someone close and actually being at a funeral. I think we need to help people increasingly to learn how to face that, to face the prospect of their own death. In other ages, they would talk more about this. In the Victorian age, they didn't talk much about sex, but they could talk quite openly about death. They would gather the clan in their dying days and impart a blessing and the inheritance, etc., and some words of wisdom. They knew how to handle those issues a lot better than we do. I think one of the issues behind the drive for voluntary euthanasia and assisted dying is a kind of projection that we're fearful that we will, and we project our fears onto the people who are dying.
Yes.
And I don't want to be disabled in some way, or I don't want to lose my marbles if I had dementia, etc. But the people who really work with people in those situations, and admittedly some are very tragic, but in many of those situations, people learn to have a meaningful life of relationships with people. It's not that they're in pain, etc. A big part of that, I think, and I think I experienced that with my father, is that, let me sum it up in two words: God knows.
Yes.
So in Psalm 139, it says that God knows us from womb to tomb. And God knows us even when we're not particularly rational.
Yes.
Like when we're asleep. God knows and upholds the universe. You know, as a kid, I used to wonder, well, you know, what goes on when I'm asleep? You know, like as if the universe should stop because I'm asleep. Well, I'm actually not at the centre of the universe. God is. God neither sleeps nor slumbers.
That's right.
God watches out for us, and I think it's that sense that God actually knows, even when we may not be functioning at our peak cognitively, that is fundamental. And how do we, if you like, hold people in the memory of God and treat them with dignity? Not just remind them of their achievements, although I would talk with, like recently, you know, basically we built a church. And I used to say, now my father he wasn't a builder, but he ran a concrete products business. And I'd joke with him and say, well, Dad, you know, I bet you never thought your son was going to be a literal church builder. And I honoured him just after his death at the launch of the church. And you know, I sort of said, well, he'd probably say, well, you'll need a lot of help. And that there's that sense of honouring his heritage that he'd passed on to me in that way. I think we need to see those generational ties. We're not just fingers cut off from the hand. And we need to affirm the relational reality of what it means to be human, even more than being rational. Rationality is a means to being relational. It's not a thing in itself.
That's exactly right.
And so I think the relational aspects, that love conquers death in the end, I think is the fundamental thing that we have to grasp. Death doesn't have the last word. The love of God and the very life of God raising Jesus from the dead is what enables us to look death in the eye, to face the sting of death, because there is a sting to it. We need to be realistic about that. But to not despair. We can grieve, but grieve in hope.
Well, that's right. And there's something to be addressed there too about the purpose of life. What are you here for at all? Are you here to achieve this over here, or are you there to live this other love-driven, purposeful, relational life?
It's 42, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so it's the meaning of life. That's the answer. But yes, more than that, yes, I think it's fundamentally relational. And we're caught up in a web of relationships in God's own character. It's a community of love, and the resurrection basically says that the things that are most significant to us, loving relationships, those who are dearest and nearest and dearest, etc., that they don't simply dissolve into and disappear into death as the final word, but those things are resurrected, and those people are resurrected too.
Yes.
That is reality. Reality is fundamentally relational.
Relational, absolutely. Well, we're coming up to a break, but perhaps what we can talk about as we go forward is the ways in which that relationship can be further developed.
Right.
We'll be back in a moment.
Mani Alleluia. Mani
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Reverend Gordon Preece. Well, this is fascinating because it's actually come through that whole process of euthanasia, which is political and it's moral and it's ethical and there's all sorts of mind stuff going on there. But perhaps there might be part of what we need to do in identifying with death as part of life is to connect with a spiritual component which ties us together as human beings. Now, as a Reverend Doctor, I reckon you might be able to have a comment about that. Where do you think that takes us?
Right. Well, it's interesting that increasingly more people seem to be regarding themselves as spiritual but not religious. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that links in with the rejection of the institutional in some ways. That's not just a religious thing. You know, there are all sorts of organisations now that basically find it hard to get volunteers, scouts, etc. It's not just religious groups that are facing that. And political parties, listening to the ABC, basically people are not interested in parties so much now, or they're tired of the idea of parties. And so seems to be a growing rejection of the institutional. I think the quest for some sort of free-flowing spirituality there are good aspects of that. You don't want to be just doing things just because the institution tells you to. But there are also dangerous aspects of that because that can get marketized. You know, people, market this particular, course for you to do or whatever, and they're making money out of it, and people can exploit that.
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting that, say, with the census, with the number of people who tick the no religion box. Now, a bit of that might have been the fact that it was elevated to the top of the
list.
From the bottom. There was a major campaign to get people to tick that box. That doesn't mean they're all atheists.
No.
The footnote and the explanation on the census form, whether people read it or not, is that it can include people who regard themselves as spiritual but not religious.
That's right.
Not belonging to a particular brand or denomination, etc. So I think the issue, I guess perhaps for religious people like me, although I don't tend to normally label myself religious, but people of faith and faith in Christ, is how do you make connections with that broader spiritual hunger that seems to be out there. Now, in some cases that will be maybe a spiritual force people are talking about. It might be nature, it might be a certain sort of power that's going on. They may have different ways of describing that. I think, speaking as a Christian, that what we would want to do is say that's not just an abstract impersonal force, but we believe that's put a face on that.
Yes.
It's not just a fate. It's not just whether your bullet happens to have your name on it or not, as they used to say in the war. It's not just a fate.
No.
There is actually a face on that.
Yes.
And that, if you like, God's spirit is the force of the future and the face of the future.
Yeah.
And Christians believe that has the future has the face of Christ attached to it.
Yes.
The resurrection is the preview of a new world in which there'll be our bodies will be spiritualized.
Yes.
Paul talks about that. Now, the great theologian Tom Wright says that's like a steam engine. The spirit is the power of our body, using the resurrection power, defeating death and defeating the fear of death, which paralyzes us so often. so often we're into denial of death. Ernst Becker wrote a book called The Denial of Death. I think we spend a lot of our time denying death, trying to distract ourselves from death, trying to keep ourselves busy, tick off our bucket list because we're fearful that somehow we won't get to the end and have ticked off all the things on that bucket list.
Exactly.
So I think we need a conversation about how do we connect that broader spiritual hunger with, I think, the hunger for love and the personal that is actually the most fundamentally personal kind of value that we have.
Absolutely. And see, what I'd sort of addressed in my mind as you were speaking is your example of that issue with your father's dying, with the children being involved, etc. Now, was behind that, do you think part of that was the opportunity for children to be connected within it's a Catholic hospital, so there's nuns and there's visible religion around. But there's also just that common factor of, because a person is old or because a person's incapacitated, they establish there's a common ground there which they're aware of.
Yeah, the older people can be very witty and funny and they children can reach out and touch them or hold their hand, or they'll reach out and touch their hand.
Yes.
Those sorts of gestures can mean an enormous amount.
That's right.
And we need to work on those intergenerational kind of bonds so that we can really learn how to be a genuine human family again. I think we're too sort of atomized and cut off from each other. We're like billiard balls that just kind of bounce off each other. We're so busy.
That's right.
We miss out on that time, that unhurried time to really connect and hear people's stories. People complain about old people talking too long, etc. But if you have a bit of patience,
yes, absolutely,
you will come up with a lot of gems.
Yes, and that's where the situation of granddad dying and then disappearing into a coffin and then disappearing, never to be seen again. Whereas some cultures, they actually go with the body all the way and dress the body and wash the body and all of that. So which is very, very rich as a tradition. I think we talk about trying to get it over and done with too often, or moving on. I like the idea of Italian nonnas wearing their black around and it's a public thing that they are grieving. That they are honouring someone. It's not something that they just do privately. No, it's something that's recognised. That's right.
And takes time and space and is honoured.
And it's been very much an honour speaking to you, Gordon, about this, because it's a great issue, and I can see some other things which your section might well be looking at, and maybe it's just what we were just discussing. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks. Thank you. No.
You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. We'll be back next week, and thanks for watching.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.